Morning everyone. In this video we'll discuss some of the key quotations around the character of Macbeth. The idea being that you could use this video for help if you get an essay on the character of Macbeth, or even if you just want to revise the character a bit. So in the exam your question will have an extract, and the question will ask you first of all about the extract, and then it will ask you about the rest of the play. So for the purposes of this video, we're not going to use an extract. We're just focusing on the second part, the whole of the play. I'll put a full exam question at the end so that you can answer it if you want to. So let's presume that your question is something along the lines of, explore how Shakespeare presents the character of Macbeth in Macbeth. I think one of the reasons why Shakespeare's plays are still being performed today is because of the complexity of the characters. There are so many different ways that you could answer a question like this one. You could say he's regretful, he's presented as optimistic, pessimistic, troubled, and so on. So today we're going to look at 5 ways that he's presented, and I'll give you a couple of key quotations to support each theory. First, we'll have a look at Macbeth being a hero. Here's a picture that we're going to use as Macbeth, the warrior king. I'm not sure why he's got an eye patch, but in this picture, he does. Now, most of the quotations that show Macbeth as brave or heroic come from Act 1, Scene 2. So we hear about Macbeth in the captain's speech. The captain is lying there dying, speaking to the king, and he says that Macbeth really deserves the title of brave. And then he goes on to explain why. He discusses that Macbeth faced down the enemy in the battle. His sword had so much blood on it from all of the killing that Macbeth has done that you could actually see the smoke coming off the sword because of the warm blood in the cold Scottish air. Macbeth goes up to the traitorous Thane of Cawdor and slices him open from the nave to the chops, so from the belly button right up to the jaw, and then he uses the guy's head as a trophy. And Duncan tells us how heroic this is with "O valiant cousin, worthy gentleman," which is basically, oh wow, that's really brave. What a man. Ross turns up a little bit later and supports the captain's description of Macbeth by describing him as Bellona's bridegroom. Now, Bellona was an ancient Roman goddess of war, and Ross is describing Macbeth as being like a husband, basically saying that his skill on the battlefield is unmatched. They all seem to think that he's amazing. And it's interesting at this point that we haven't actually met Macbeth yet. So the audience is getting an idea of what kind of person Macbeth is like before we've actually met him. His reputation precedes him. And finally, the last quotation that I picked goes the other way. In Act 3, Scene 1, Macbeth is speaking to some hitmen, and he says, "I will advise you where to plant yourselves." Now, I chose this one because it shows how unheroic Macbeth is. It makes him out to be a coward. He wants Banquo to be killed, but he's too cowardly to do it himself, so he hires some other people to do it for him. So this quote shows Macbeth as being unheroic. A little challenge for you here: if you're writing about Macbeth being a hero, research Aristotle's tragic hero and write about how Macbeth fits into this theory. Next, we'll discuss a few quotations that show Macbeth's ambition in the play. First off, in Act 1, Scene 3, Macbeth has just met the witches and they've told him their prophecies. The witches say that he's the Thane of Glamis, he will be made Thane of Cawdor, and will one day be king. Then, Ross and Angus turn up and tell him that he's just been made Thane of Cawdor. And Macbeth says, "Two truths are told as happy prologues to the swelling act of the imperial theme." Which is basically, the witches were right about 2 things. Thane of Glamis and Thane of Cawdor. So maybe they're right about me becoming king too. This is the point where the words of the witches begin to play on Macbeth's mind and start him thinking about what his ambitions are, about the things that he wants in life. Later in the same scene, Macbeth says, "Why do I yield to that suggestion whose horrid image doth unfix my hair and make my seated heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature?" Which is basically him admitting that the thought of murdering King Duncan, as horrible as that thought might be, is in his head. He's considering murder to get what he wants, and he's a little bit disturbed that his own brain has come up with this plan. Now in the next scene, Duncan announced that his son, Malcolm, will be the next in line to the throne. Macbeth determines that Malcolm, who is the Prince of Cumberland, is a step on which I must fall down or else overleap, for in my way it lies. So essentially, Malcolm, the king's son, is something in the way of Macbeth's path to the throne, and Macbeth knows he will have to remove Malcolm in some kind of way if he wishes to realise his ambitions and become the King of Scotland. A few scenes later, in Act 1 Scene 7, Macbeth is thinking about murdering King Duncan. He hasn't done it yet, but he's thinking about it. And he says, "I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which overleaps itself and falls on the other." Here he's basically saying, I've got nothing to motivate me to kill the king apart from pure ambition. And ambition is the sort of thing that makes people race ahead of themselves and usually leads to disaster. A while later, in Act 3 Scene 4, which is the scene where Banquo's ghost makes an appearance, Macbeth says, "For mine own good all causes shall give way." Here he's saying that his ambition, his desires, trump anything else, so anything that benefits him is the only thing that matters. On this slide there are a few quotations that might be useful to you if you're taking the angle that Macbeth is controlled throughout the play. I've seen some posters for the play that show Macbeth as a puppet, and that someone else is controlling his actions. If you agree with this interpretation of the character, then this slide is for you. In Act 1 Scene 3, Macbeth meets the witches and each of them greets him with a line. The first calls him the Thane of Glamis, which is true, but kinda strange that a random woman would know who he is. Keep in mind that they didn't exactly have photos or Google back then. And the second witch calls him the Thane of Cawdor, which becomes true by the end of this scene. And the third calls him king. Now I've included this quote because I don't think that Macbeth would have murdered Duncan if the witches hadn't put this idea in his head first. It's this greeting that sets the whole events of the play in motion. And by putting this idea in Macbeth's head, the witches essentially managed to control Macbeth's actions. And Banquo sees the effect that the witches have on Macbeth, and he says that Macbeth is rapt. Now the word rapt comes from the Latin word raptus, which basically translates to kidnapped. So Banquo is acknowledging that the witches have kidnapped Macbeth's mind, making them in control of Macbeth. Then, in that same scene, Macbeth says, "If chance will have me king, why, chance may crown me without my stir." So here he is indicating that chance is the one in control, not himself. He seems to conclude that if fate wants him to be king, then fate will make him king without him having to do anything. Note that this changes later when Duncan announces that Malcolm is next in line to the throne. Fast forward to Act 1 Scene 7 and Macbeth is having doubts about killing Duncan. He tries to put his foot down and says, "We will proceed no further in this business." And then Lady Macbeth starts asking him if he's afraid and if he's a coward, and then she goes on to say, "When you durst do it, then you are a man." Here she insults his masculinity and says that he can only call himself a man once he has killed Duncan. Insulting a husband in this way seems to work. By the end of the scene, Macbeth has decided to go through with it. So we could say that Lady Macbeth manipulates Macbeth with her language in this scene. Then, in the famous dagger speech, Act 2 Scene 1, Macbeth speaks to the dagger saying, "Thou marshallest me the way that I was going," suggesting that maybe he isn't the one in control of his actions here. It could be the witches have a hand in this hallucination. Either way, the fact that he is hallucinating suggests that maybe he's not fully in control of himself in this scene. And finally, for showing that he's not in control, we can also look at Act 3 Scene 5. Hecate is speaking to the witches and telling them off for playing around with Macbeth without her permission, and she says she's going to make a spell that will trick Macbeth with illusions. Now these illusions are the prophecies that the witches make in their second meeting with Macbeth, which suggests that once again he is under control of the witches. Next, we'll look at Shakespeare presenting Macbeth as conflicted. Now, when the witches first make their predictions in Act 1, Scene 3, Macbeth notes that this supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good. So here we can tell he knows and is fully aware that the witches may be up to no good, but he eventually follows what they say anyway. It's as if they've told him what he already wanted to hear, so he just goes with it. But initially, at least, he seems to be in two minds about the witches and their prophecies. Act 1, Scene 7 is a really good place to look for quotes to show that Macbeth is in two minds about killing Duncan. At the start of the scene, he doesn't really want to do it, and by the end, he's made up his mind to do it. So he starts off with a big monologue full of inner turmoil, where he says this quote. He talks about how committing violent crimes usually comes back to bite you, and he personifies justice, saying that justice will make you drink from a poisoned cup. Essentially, he's saying that he doesn't want to go through with the murder because he's scared of karma. He's scared of what might happen to him as a result of committing the murder in the first place. Which is quite interesting for a soldier who has been praised endlessly for his killing skills. Later in that same scene, Lady Macbeth starts insulting his masculinity, as we've already said, and here he's saying that he dares to do anything that is right for a man to do, and anyone who does more than that, i.e. commit murder or regicide, that person can't call themselves a man anymore. They're more of a monster. So here we can see the inner conflict that Macbeth faces, as he's clearly not comfortable with the idea of murder. But he kills Duncan anyway, and after the murder he starts to freak out a bit. There are a couple of quotes in Act 2 Scene 2 that show he regrets his actions. I've just picked two of them. One is, "I had most need of blessing, and amen stuck in my throat," where his sense of guilt is so overwhelming that he couldn't even bring himself to ask for God's blessing. He knows what he has done is wrong. And the second quote that I picked from this scene is when Macbeth looks at his hands and says, "They're a sorry sight." We can clearly see his guilt and regret over killing the noble Duncan in his sleep when Duncan trusted him fully. Note that this changes. Eventually, Lady Macbeth becomes the guilt-ridden one, and Macbeth goes on to have a bit more of a ruthless, one-track mind and starts ordering murders left, right and centre. Which brings us on to our final slide. Macbeth as villainous. Now there are so many quotations for this that we could do an entire video about quotes that show Macbeth is villainous. We'll start with Lady Macbeth's quote from Act 1 Scene 5. She tells Macbeth that he needs to look like the innocent flower but be the serpent under it. Here she's essentially telling Macbeth to look all innocent to Duncan's face, make him feel secure and welcome, while secretly being the violent and venomous end to Duncan's life. It's the ultimate act of two-facedness. And the fact that Macbeth does it, treats the king like a welcome guest and then kills him, is a definite act of villainy. After the murder of Duncan, Macbeth talks about having hangman's hands, because he realises that now he's not just a soldier anymore, he's now a murderer, an executioner. And a little later on, Macbeth starts worrying about the witch's third prophecy. Remember, they said that Banquo's descendants would be king, not Macbeth's. So whilst admitting the murder of Duncan in this quote, he also plans to have his best friend Banquo murdered, as well as Banquo's children. Now maybe killing Duncan affected him in some way, because he doesn't kill Banquo himself, he orders some other people to do it. And later on, he says that, "I am in blood stepped in so far that should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go over." Meaning that all these murders have created a metaphorical river of blood. And he's walking through the river now, and he's so far into the river that going back to being good will be just as hard as carrying on being evil. So he just decides to crack on with being evil, and he goes on to have Macduff's entire family murdered too. And finally, we have Macduff's opinion on Macbeth when he says, "Not in the legions of horrid hell can come a devil more damned in evils to top Macbeth." Which is basically, if you searched all of hell, you wouldn't find anyone as evil as Macbeth, which is quite a statement considering the devil is supposed to be the greatest villain of all. Here, Macduff is saying that Macbeth is even worse than Satan himself. Here, we've got a challenge question which is written in the style of the exam. You have an extract from Act 5, Scene 8, the end of the play where Macduff and Macbeth are fighting, and the question says, starting with this section, explain how far you think Shakespeare presents Macbeth as a hero. Write about how Shakespeare presents Macbeth in this section of the play, and how Shakespeare presents Macbeth as a whole. My advice is to follow the essay structure that your teacher has given you, but if it were me, I'd go for one paragraph on the bullet point 1, which focuses on this extract, then one paragraph on the second bullet point, which asks you to focus on the whole of the play. So for this second bullet point, you can use any of the quotations that we've looked at in this video. And then, if you have time, one more paragraph on a bullet point of your choice. So in the 45 minutes, you'd have around 3 paragraphs in your essay. Now the best way to improve in English is to write a practice response, get some feedback on it, and then use that feedback to improve your next practice response. So if you're challenging yourself and aiming to improve, pause the video and give this question a go. It might be useful for you to create some cue cards for Macbeth and the key quotations around him. If you use them properly, cue cards are a great way to revise the characters, the themes, and the text, and they are always more useful if you make them yourself as opposed to just buying a set. Now you can add the quotations from this video, and you can add any extras that you have thought of yourself. Remember, this video is nowhere near a complete list of Macbeth quotes. And that's it for this video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, like and subscribe for future videos. And if there's anything that you want me to make a video on, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and happy revising.